Imagine a world where the gods were not spiritual beings, but flesh and blood, where the heavens were filled not with angels, but with warships, where humanity was created not by chance or divine will, but as a workforce for an alien race desperate for gold. Now imagine another race, older, wiser, and driven by compassion, descending from the Pleiades to set humanity free. Two civilizations, one planet. A war that would destroy the first human empire and leave behind only myths, ashes, and a radioactive cloud that still haunts the ancient records. This is the untold story of the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians, and the battle for control of Earth. Ever since the beginning of humanity, countless theories revolving around the origin of mankind have been proposed. From religious creation stories to scientific models of evolution, humans have always searched for answers to the same fundamental questions. Where did we come from, and why are we here? One such possible theory, according to interpretations of ancient cultures, is the idea of contact between powerful extraterrestrial civilizations long before recorded history. Among the most discussed names in these theories are the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians, two groups described as beings who may have influenced humanity in very different ways. And at the center of this possibility lies a dramatic question. What if Earth was not only a cradle of life, but also a battleground? What if the reason behind a conflict between these civilizations was simple, yet enormous in consequence? Who would control and rule over Earth? Earth remains the only planet known to support life, and it continues to be one of the greatest enigmas of existence. According to modern science and mainstream religion, the foundations of humanity are already established. Evolution explains the biological development of our species, while sacred traditions provide spiritual origins and purpose. But when we look deeper into the records of ancient civilizations, those that existed thousands of years ago, we begin to encounter something different. Stories that do not fit neatly into modern explanations. Accounts of beings descending from the heavens. Descriptions of gods who were not merely symbolic, but physical, present, and deeply involved in human affairs. This leads us back to the questions that have echoed through time. How did humanity emerge on the planet Earth in the first place? Who or what created the humans? And why do so many ancient cultures speak of divine visitors arriving from the stars? According to many of these ancient records, human civilization was not entirely alone in its earliest days. Instead, it may have been aided, guided, or even manipulated by extraterrestrial civilizations, especially by the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians. These names appear repeatedly in modern interpretations of ancient mythology, and although they are surrounded by speculation, they continue to fascinate those who believe that the truth of our past may be far stranger than we have been taught. To understand this theory, we must first explore who these beings were said to be. Alien races that visited the Earth. In Sumerian mythology, the Anunnaki were a pantheon of gods and goddesses associated with both creation and destruction, representing a duality of power. The word Anunnaki is often translated as those who came from heaven to earth. In traditional academic understanding, these were mythological deities within Mesopotamian religion, but in alternative theories, the Anunnaki are interpreted as something else entirely, extraterrestrial beings who came to Earth in the distant past. According to some resources, these gods came from a planet called Nibiru, a mysterious celestial body sometimes described as a wandering planet with a long orbit. One of the best-known theories about human creation suggests that the Anunnaki settled on Earth, establishing cities, control bases, and centers of influence. It is believed by theorists that they were extremely similar to modern humans in physical appearance, humanoid, not monstrous, not unrecognizable, but strangely familiar. However, the major difference described between these beings and humans was their skin tone, often said to have a grayish hue, a detail that has fueled countless interpretations and comparisons in modern popular culture. According to the story, an ecological cataclysm struck their home planet. Their world was deteriorating, and they were forced to travel to Earth in search of resources, especially gold. Gold, in these theories, was not merely a luxury, but a substance essential to their survival, possibly for atmospheric repair or advanced technology. This narrative appears in different forms across ancient civilizations. but is most commonly associated with Sumerian mythology. The Sumerians also spoke of unusual measurements of time. They claimed that a year on planet Nibiru, known as a sar, was equivalent to 3,600 Earth years. If this is taken literally, then the lifespan of the Anunnaki becomes almost unimaginable. The Anunnaki were said to live for 120 sars. That is 120 multiplied by 3,600, a total of 432,000 years. Such numbers push beyond the limits of human comprehension, and yet they remain preserved in ancient texts, raising questions about what these figures truly meant. Were they symbolic, or were they records of beings who existed on a scale far beyond humanity? The Pleiadians. Alongside the Anunnaki, theorists often speak of another group, the Pleiadians. Unlike the Anunnaki, who are frequently portrayed as rulers and engineers of humanity, the Pleiadians are described as unconditional beings driven by love, wisdom, and light. The Pleiadians are believed to be far older than humanity and therefore more developed, both spiritually and technologically. In these accounts, they possessed a greater sense of empathy and harmony, often wanting to exist in solidarity with other civilizations rather than dominate them. According to these theories, they descended upon Earth not to enslave, but to help humanity, to guide it, to protect it, to ensure that humans could evolve freely rather than remain trapped under oppression. This is why, believers argue, traces of them can be found across countless ancient cultures, recorded under different names, described with different symbols, but sharing an almost identical history. Beings who arrived from the cluster of the Pleiades, visitors from the stars. War between the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians. Many theories related to this conflict suggest that the deities who came from the heavens were not simply spiritual metaphors, but advanced beings from space. Beings who accelerated humanity's development, teaching early humans knowledge, technology, and civilization itself. The first humans, with their rudimentary tools and basic understanding, observed the extraordinary abilities these visitors possessed, abilities far beyond anything humans could achieve, things that were totally out of reach, out of comprehension. Naturally, humans began to worship them as superior beings, as gods. They learned techniques, adopted rituals, and shaped their societies around these celestial figures. And in doing so, human history may have taken a dramatic turn. But here is where the division begins. The Pleiadians, described as harmonious beings of light, did not agree with the slavery-based attitude that the Anunnaki allegedly held toward humanity. This difference in philosophy created tension. Two civilizations, two ideologies, one viewing humanity as a workforce, the other viewing humanity as a species deserving freedom. And slowly, these differences began to grow into something far greater, a conflict not only between alien races, but over the future of Earth itself. As these theories suggest, the relationship between humanity and these so-called visitors from the heavens was never equal. Humans, in their earliest stages, were fragile, unadvanced, and limited by the natural constraints of their environment. Survival itself was a daily struggle. And then, according to these accounts, something extraordinary happened. Beings arrived who possessed knowledge beyond anything humans could imagine. They understood the movements of the stars, the mathematics of the cosmos, the secrets of construction, agriculture, and governance. They carried themselves not as wanderers, but as rulers, entities who seemed to operate on a scale far above human life. In the eyes of early mankind, such beings could only be gods. The Anunnaki, as described in Sumerian mythology, were not distant deities existing only in the spiritual realm. They were present, involved, and deeply intertwined with the shaping of civilization. Alternative theorists argue that the Anunnaki did not simply inspire humanity, but actively engineered it. That humanity's rise was not entirely natural, that our civilization was accelerated, guided, and perhaps even controlled. The belief is that the Anunnaki, arriving from Nibiru, established themselves as rulers of Earth, constructing cities and bases that would serve as centers of power. In these theories, Earth was not just a new world. It was a resource, a territory, a planet rich with materials, life, and potential, and above all, rich with gold. Gold is central to the Anunnaki narrative because it is portrayed not merely as a precious metal, but as something essential for their survival. The idea is that their home planet faced ecological collapse, and Earth became their solution. But extracting gold was difficult. The labor required was immense, and thus, theorists claim humanity was created or modified to serve a purpose, not as an equal civilization, but as a workforce. This is where the darker interpretation begins. Humans were not simply children of the gods. They were tools, servants, a species shaped to build, mine, and obey. If this was truly the intention of the Anunnaki, then Earth's earliest civilization may have been founded not on freedom, but on control. And this is precisely where the Pleiadians enter the story, because in these theories, the Pleiadians represented the opposite force. They were not conquerors, they were not rulers. They were described as beings of harmony, empathy, and spiritual advancement. Where the Anunnaki were associated with authority and domination, the Pleiadians were associated with compassion and liberation. This fundamental difference would become the seed of conflict. Humanity between two powers. Imagine the position of early humanity in such a scenario. A young species, barely understanding its own world, suddenly caught between forces far beyond comprehension. On one side, the Anunnaki, portrayed as powerful, technologically advanced beings who demanded obedience and labor. On the other side, the Pleiadians, portrayed as older, wiser beings who sought to uplift humanity rather than enslave it. Humans, unable to grasp the true nature of these visitors, responded in the only way they could. They worshipped. They built temples. They offered sacrifices. They shaped their societies around the will of these celestial figures. And in doing so, they unknowingly became participants in a much larger struggle. Theories suggest that the gods of ancient mythology may have been more than symbolic. They may have been memories of actual beings, misinterpreted through the lens of primitive understanding. And if so, then ancient religion becomes something else entirely, not fiction, but distorted history. Signs in ancient cultures. Supporters of these theories often point to the striking similarities between mythologies across the world. Why do so many civilizations speak of gods descending from the heavens? Why do so many cultures describe star beings, divine teachers, and cosmic battles? From Mesopotamia to Egypt, from the Americas to Asia, stories repeat with uncanny familiarity. Visitors from above, civilization granted suddenly, knowledge delivered as if from nowhere. Could these be coincidences? Or could they be fragments of a forgotten truth? The Pleiadians, believers argue, appear across cultures under different names. Sometimes they are described as luminous beings, sometimes as divine messengers, sometimes as protectors, always connected to the stars. The Anunnaki, meanwhile, appear in Sumerian texts as rulers, judges, and creators, entities who shaped humanity's destiny. If these two groups truly existed, then Earth was never isolated. It was connected, watched, visited, and contested. The rising conflict. The division between the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians, according to these accounts, was not immediate. At first, both groups were present in humanity's early development, but as humans advanced, the question of control became unavoidable. The Anunnaki, portrayed as rulers who required labor and obedience, could not allow humanity to become fully independent. A free humanity would mean the loss of their dominance. The Pleiadians, on the other hand, could not accept a system built on slavery and oppression. They saw humanity not as property, but as a living civilization with the potential to evolve. Thus, differences turned into disagreements. Disagreements turned into hostility, and hostility eventually turned into war. Not a war fought with swords or armies, but with technology beyond human imagination. A conflict that, according to theorists, may have left scars upon the Earth itself. The mystery of Sumer's collapse. One of the most chilling pieces of this theory centers around the sudden end of the Sumerian civilization. The Sumerians are widely regarded as the first known civilization in human history. They developed writing, cities, laws, astronomy, and complex society. They were not primitive, they were advanced for their time, and yet they collapsed abruptly. The Sumerian civilization came to an end around the mid-2024 BC period. Mainstream history explains this decline through invasion, climate shifts, and political instability, but alternative theorists propose something far more unsettling. They believe that a mysterious radioactive cloud carried by winds from the Sinai Peninsula wiped out the civilization, a deadly phenomenon that appeared as if out of nowhere. This raises a disturbing question: how could a radioactive cloud exist in the ancient world? Radiation is not something that occurs naturally in such a sudden and destructive form. The most logical explanation, with modern understanding, would be the aftermath of a nuclear explosion, and this is where the theory becomes explosive. Supporters claim that the collapse of Sumer was not merely political, it was collateral damage, a victim of a war between extraterrestrial civilizations. A war between the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians fought over the control of Earth. The idea that an ancient civilization like Sumer could have been destroyed by something resembling nuclear fallout is one of the most controversial elements of these theories. It challenges everything we believe about the ancient world, because if such an event truly occurred, then it would mean that advanced weaponry existed long before modern technology. It would mean that Earth was the stage for forces beyond human capability. And it would mean that the myths carved into clay tablets may not have been symbolic stories, but eyewitness accounts. Of course, mainstream archaeology does not confirm a literal extraterrestrial war. The Anunnaki are understood academically as mythological deities, part of Mesopotamian religious tradition, but alternative theorists argue that mythology often preserves fragments of real events, retold through the limited language of ancient people. To them, the question becomes, what if ancient texts are not fantasy, but history misunderstood? The Tablets of Sumer. Sumerian civilization left behind one of humanity's greatest treasures, written records. Thousands of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform script. These tablets describe gods, kings, creation, destruction, and events that shaped the world. Supporters of the Anunnaki theory often point to these texts as evidence that something extraordinary was remembered. The tablets speak of beings descending from the heavens, of rulers who were not human, of great conflicts among the gods themselves, and of catastrophic events that altered the earth. To ancient scribes, these beings were divine, but to modern theorists, they may have been visitors from another world. The Anunnaki were described not as distant spirits, but as active participants. They walked among humans, they commanded cities, they shaped society, and in doing so, they became the architects of early civilization. But the Sumerians also recorded something else. They recorded struggle, tension among the gods, battles in the heavens, and destruction that came like fire from above. If interpreted literally, these accounts could suggest warfare of unimaginable scale. Weapons of the gods. Many ancient cultures describe divine weapons, weapons that sound strangely similar to modern concepts of advanced technology. In Hindu epics, there are descriptions of weapons that release blinding light and poison the air. In Mesopotamian myths, gods unleash storms of fire. In countless traditions, the heavens become a battlefield. Supporters of these theories argue that ancient people could only describe advanced weapons using the language they had. A missile becomes a bolt of lightning. An explosion becomes fire from the sky. Radiation becomes a curse that poisons the land. If an extraterrestrial conflict occurred, humans would not have understood it scientifically. They would have understood it mythologically. Thus, the war between the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians is framed as a war of ideology and power, not merely a dispute, but a battle for Earth itself. Earth as the prize. Why would Earth matter so much? In these theories, Earth is unique, a planet of abundant life, a world rich in resources, a strategic location in the cosmos. To the Anunnaki, Earth was valuable for gold and labor. To the Pleiadians, Earth was valuable for its living potential. Humanity, caught in the middle, became the deciding factor. If humans remained enslaved, Earth would remain under Anunnaki control. If humans became free, Earth could evolve independently. Thus, theorists suggest that the conflict was inevitable, because control over humanity meant control over the planet, and the planet in this story was the ultimate prize. The slave yoke theory. One of the most repeated claims in Anunnaki interpretations is that humans were created as workers, that early humans were genetically altered or engineered to serve. The Anunnaki, needing labor for mining and construction, allegedly designed humanity as a hybrid species, part earthly, part Anunnaki. This is why, believers argue, humans possess intelligence beyond what evolution alone might explain, why civilization rose so quickly, why ancient societies seem to appear almost suddenly. The Pleiadians, however, are portrayed as opposing this system. They did not agree with humanity being treated as property. They believed humans should grow naturally, spiritually, and freely. Thus, the relationship between the two groups deteriorated, and eventually, according to the theory, Earth became divided. Anunnaki influence in certain regions, Pleiadian guidance in others, humanity unknowingly shaped by both. The catastrophe in the ancient world. If the war escalated, then the devastation would not have remained hidden. Supporters of the theory point to strange archaeological mysteries. Cities abandoned suddenly, regions described as cursed or uninhabitable, ancient stories of fire raining from the heavens, and above all, the sudden collapse of Sumer. The idea of a radioactive cloud drifting from Sinai is often connected to the notion of an explosion beyond conventional ancient warfare, a weapon that left the land poisoned, a disaster that could not be explained by swords or chariots. If such an event occurred, it would have been remembered as divine wrath, as punishment from the gods, as the end of an age. And perhaps that is exactly how it was written down, not as a war between aliens, but as a war between gods. The silence of history. One of the greatest arguments against this theory is simple. If such a war occurred, why is there no clear record? Why do we not have undeniable evidence? Supporters respond with another question. What if history was rewritten? What if the truth was buried beneath myth? What if ancient people recorded what they saw, but later generations misunderstood it as religion? And what if the greatest events of the distant past were never meant to be remembered clearly? The absence of direct proof becomes, for believers, part of the mystery, because myths are all that remain. Fragments, symbols, clues carved into stone and clay, enough to suggest possibility, but never enough to confirm certainty. As the story continues through the lens of these theories, the Anunnaki are not simply remembered as distant gods sitting beyond the skies, but as rulers who were deeply embedded in the earliest structure of human civilization, beings who did not merely observe Earth but actively shaped it, establishing what some describe as control bases, cities, and centers of authority that became the foundations of early society. And this is where the narrative begins to blur the boundary between mythology and speculation. Because in the Sumerian records, the Anunnaki are consistently portrayed as powerful figures who descend, command, judge, create, and destroy. And while academic history interprets these descriptions as symbolic representations of divine order, alternative theorists insist that such accounts may preserve echoes of something literal, that perhaps the gods were not supernatural spirits, but physical beings whose technology appeared godlike to primitive humans. And in this interpretation, the rapid emergence of complex civilization in Mesopotamia becomes one of the central mysteries, because the Sumerians developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and governance with a suddenness that has long fascinated researchers, and believers argue that this acceleration could be the result of external influence, that humanity was not left alone to climb slowly, but was pushed forward by forces with their own agenda. And if the Anunnaki required labor, obedience, and control, then humanity's development was never meant to lead to freedom, but to efficiency, to productivity, to a structured system where humans served a role within a larger design. And this is precisely why the Pleiadians become such a crucial counterpoint in the theory, because they are portrayed as the opposite presence, beings whose motivation was not extraction, but empathy, not domination, but upliftment. And thus the Earth becomes the meeting ground of two ideologies, one that views humanity as a tool and one that views humanity as a living civilization worthy of autonomy. And according to these accounts, the tension between these two forces would have been inevitable because a planet as unique as Earth, rich with life and potential, could not remain neutral, and humanity itself becomes the center of the struggle, worshipping the visitors as gods without understanding the deeper conflict unfolding above them, learning techniques, adopting rituals, building temples, and shaping culture around beings whose true nature remained beyond comprehension. And over time, the disagreement grows sharper as the Pleiadians, described as harmonious and spiritually advanced, could not accept the enslavement of a young species, while the Anunnaki, portrayed as rulers tied to resource needs and authority, could not allow their control to weaken. And thus the myths of ancient cultures begin to take on a darker tone. Stories of gods fighting gods, of divine councils breaking apart, of fire from the heavens, of lands cursed and cities destroyed, and supporters of these theories argue that such myths are not random inventions, but distorted memories of catastrophic events, because ancient humans, lacking scientific language, could only describe advanced warfare as storms of flame, bolts of lightning, weapons of unbearable brightness, and poison that lingered in the air. And in this framework, the collapse of Sumer becomes not merely a political decline, but the shadow of something far more violent, the possibility that a conflict between these extraterrestrial factions escalated into devastation that spilled onto human civilization, leaving behind silence, abandonment, and the haunting suggestion of a radioactive cloud drifting across the ancient world. And although there is no literal historical record that openly declares an alien war, theorists point to the gaps, the abrupt endings, the recurring patterns across mythologies, the strange consistency of sky gods descending across cultures separated by oceans, and they ask whether humanity's oldest stories are not simply tales of imagination, but fragmented testimonies of encounters with forces beyond Earth. And so the mystery remains suspended between possibility and legend, because if the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians were real, then the origin of mankind is not only a story of evolution or creation, but a story of intervention, conflict, and a planet that may have been contested long before humans understood what it meant to rule themselves. As these theories expand further, they begin to suggest that the greatest evidence of such encounters may not lie in a single clear artifact or an undeniable record, but in the lingering fingerprints of knowledge that appeared too early, too suddenly, and too universally across the ancient world. Because when we examine the rise of early civilizations, we find humanity moving from primitive survival into structured society with astonishing speed, building cities aligned with the heavens, developing calendars that tracked celestial cycles, creating systems of mathematics and astronomy that required observation far beyond basic necessity. And supporters of these ideas argue that such advancements may have been seeded by external guidance. That the Anunnaki, establishing themselves as rulers, brought with them not only authority, but technological understanding that transformed human capability. And in this interpretation, the temples of Mesopotamia were not merely places of worship, but centers of control, places where humans interacted with their gods, offering labor and devotion in exchange for protection and instruction. And this is where the narrative of manipulation becomes strongest, because if humanity was shaped to serve, then knowledge was never given freely but strategically, enough to build civilization, enough to extract resources, enough to maintain systems of obedience, yet never enough to allow complete independence, and thus human societies developed under the shadow of divine oversight, believing themselves guided by higher powers, while unknowingly operating within the designs of beings whose motives were not spiritual but practical, and yet within the same framework. The presence of the Pleiadians is portrayed as an opposing current, subtle but persistent, beings who did not seek temples of domination, but moments of liberation, who wished humanity to evolve beyond servitude, and theorists claim that this is why ancient traditions across the world contain dualities of gods, some demanding sacrifice and obedience, others offering wisdom and freedom, because perhaps these myths preserved the memory of competing influences, rival factions whose philosophies clashed over the destiny of Earth, and as this conflict intensified, humanity would have remained largely unaware of the true scale of what was unfolding, interpreting disagreements among extraterrestrial civilizations as wars among deities, seeing the sky as a stage for divine battles, and recording these events in the only language available to them. Through symbolism, poetry, and sacred myth, and thus stories of gods unleashing fire, of heavens splitting with light, of lands becoming poisoned and uninhabitable, become, in the eyes of believers, descriptions of advanced warfare beyond ancient comprehension, and this is why certain regions of the ancient world are surrounded by legends of curse and desolation, because if catastrophic weapons were ever used, then the scars would remain not only in soil but in memory, passed down through generations as warnings of divine wrath. And within this interpretation, the abrupt collapse of civilizations like Sumer is not an isolated historical accident, but a consequence of a struggle far greater than human politics. Because if the Anunnaki sought control and the Pleiadians sought liberation, then Earth itself became the contested ground, and humanity became both the prize and the casualty, shaped by forces it could not understand, lifted by knowledge, yet burdened by servitude. And the silence of history becomes part of the mystery, because no tablet explicitly declares an alien war. No inscription plainly states that nuclear fire fell from the heavens, and yet the myths remain, the patterns remain, the recurring image of beings descending from the stars remains, leaving modern minds suspended between skepticism and fascination, wondering whether these ancient accounts are nothing more than imagination, or whether they are fractured echoes of encounters that would redefine everything we believe about our origins. And so the theory persists, not as confirmed history, but as an enduring enigma, a possibility that humanity's earliest chapters may have included visitors, conflicts, and influences that were later transformed into gods, legends, and the sacred stories that still haunt the world today. As the narrative moves deeper into the ancient memory of the stars, theorists often point toward one striking detail that appears again and again across civilizations separated by oceans and thousands of years: the unusual importance of the Pleiades, a star cluster that has been referenced in mythologies from Mesopotamia to Greece, from the Americas to Asia, as though humanity has always looked toward that region of the sky with a sense of recognition. And within the framework of these theories, this is not accidental, because the Pleiadians are believed to have originated from that cluster, and thus their presence becomes embedded not only in speculative accounts of extraterrestrial contact, but in the very way ancient peoples mapped meaning onto the heavens, seeing the stars not merely as distant lights, but as homes of divine beings, as gateways, as origins. And supporters argue that if the Pleiadians truly descended upon Earth, then their memory would not survive through direct historical record, but through sacred tradition, through the symbolic language of star lore, where celestial visitors became gods, guides, and protectors. And this is why so many cultures describe beings who arrived from above to teach, to heal, to uplift. Because in this interpretation, the Pleiadians represented a force of empathy, a civilization that sought to assist humanity rather than exploit it, and yet their presence, according to these accounts, would have placed them directly against the Anunnaki, whose influence was tied to authority, hierarchy, and control. Because if the Anunnaki established themselves as rulers on Earth, then power itself became sacred, kingship became divine, and the structures of early civilization were built upon the belief that rulers were chosen by gods, that obedience was cosmic order, and theorists suggest that this is how extraterrestrial influence could have shaped not only technology, but politics, embedding domination into the foundations of society, and thus the struggle between the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians becomes not only a war of beings, but a war of principles, one that echoes through human history itself, because humanity's earliest systems often revolved around servitude, temples, labor, sacrifice, and unquestioned authority. While at the same time, myths also carried visions of liberation, enlightenment, and divine compassion, and believers argue that this duality reflects competing influences, rival presences that humanity could not fully understand, and as the tension escalated, the Earth would have become increasingly unstable, because advanced civilizations in conflict would not fight with primitive means, and any clash between such forces would leave devastation beyond the scale of ancient warfare. And so stories of heavenly battles, of gods unleashing destruction, of lands turned barren, become, in the eyes of theorists, fragments of an ancient catastrophe, not simply invented tales, but distorted recollections of events too immense for human language. And within this view, the collapse of early civilizations becomes part of a broader pattern, because sudden endings, abandoned cities, and legends of cursed regions may represent moments where the struggle spilled into the human world, and yet despite the absence of undeniable proof, the persistence of these stories across cultures continues to fuel speculation. Because why do humans everywhere speak of sky beings, of creators from above, of divine rulers who shaped the world? And why does the Pleiades cluster hold such symbolic power, appearing as a celestial marker in so many traditions? And thus, the mystery deepens, because if humanity was influenced by forces beyond Earth, then our myths may be the only surviving testimony, preserving not facts in the modern sense, but echoes, shadows, and symbols of encounters that shaped civilization. And in that sense, the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians become more than names. They become archetypes of control and liberation, domination and empathy, darkness and light, a cosmic struggle reflected through the rise of humanity itself, leaving us to wonder whether these ancient stories are nothing more than imagination projected onto the stars, or whether the stars once looked back and history began under the gaze of visitors whose true legacy remains hidden beneath the myths of gods. As these theories approach what is often described as the climax of the conflict, the narrative begins to take on the scale of an ending, as though the ancient world itself stood at the edge of a catastrophic transformation. Because if the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians truly represented opposing forces struggling over the fate of humanity, then the inevitable outcome would not have been a quiet separation, but an eruption of power that could alter civilizations permanently. And in the myths of many cultures, this is exactly what appears. Stories of gods turning against one another, of heavenly councils breaking apart, of divine weapons unleashed, of an age brought to ruin by fire and wrath. And supporters of these interpretations argue that such stories may be memories of a conflict that reached beyond ideology into devastation, because advanced beings, if they existed, would not wage war in ways humans could comprehend, and thus, the destruction would have seemed apocalyptic. Recorded as storms of flame, as unbearable light, as poisonous winds that lingered long after the battle ended. And it is here that the mystery of the so-called radioactive cloud becomes central again, because the sudden collapse of Sumer, one of humanity's earliest and most influential civilizations, has always been a haunting question. And while mainstream explanations speak of invasion, drought, and political decline, theorists propose that something far more violent may have occurred, that the land itself became unsafe, that the air carried death, that the destruction was not merely social, but environmental. And in this framework, the war between the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians is imagined as spilling onto Earth, leaving human societies caught in the crossfire, because humanity, created or guided under divine influence, would have been powerless against the consequences of such a struggle. And thus, the end of an age becomes not simply a historical transition, but a scar, a rupture in the continuity of civilization, remembered as divine punishment because humans could not understand it as warfare. And this is why ancient texts often describe destruction in moral or spiritual terms, as though the gods struck the world because of human failure, when perhaps, believers argue, the truth was that humans were only collateral victims of conflicts beyond their control. And in this sense, the Anunnaki are portrayed as beings unwilling to relinquish dominance, maintaining systems of hierarchy and labor, while the Pleiadians are portrayed as resisting such oppression, attempting to free humanity from servitude. And the struggle becomes symbolic of two paths for Earth itself, one where humans remain bound to rulers from above, and one where humans inherit their own destiny. And yet, even within these theories, the outcome is never presented as a simple victory, because the aftermath is silence. The gods retreat, the divine age ends, civilizations fall, and humanity is left alone with myths as the only inheritance. And thus the question becomes not only whether such beings existed, but why the stories persist so powerfully, because across the world, ancient peoples spoke of a time when gods walked among men, when knowledge arrived suddenly, when battles shook the heavens, and when an age ended in catastrophe. And whether these accounts are symbolic or literal, they reveal something profound about the human imagination and the human longing for origin, because humanity has always sensed that its beginnings contain mysteries unresolved. And so the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians remain enduring figures in speculative history, representing the possibility that Earth's earliest chapters were shaped not only by nature and evolution, but by encounters, interventions, and conflicts that were later transformed into legend, leaving us standing in the present with only fragments of clay tablets, star myths, and unanswered questions, wondering whether the gods of the ancient world were truly gods, or whether they were something else entirely, visitors from beyond, whose struggle for Earth faded into the silence of forgotten time. In the aftermath of what these theories describe as a catastrophic struggle, the ancient world enters a different kind of silence, as though the age of direct divine presence faded, and humanity was left standing among the ruins of its earliest chapters. Because if the gods of mythology were once interpreted as beings who walked openly among, then the sudden retreat of these figures becomes one of the most haunting elements of the story, since across cultures, there is often a dividing line between a mythical age, when celestial beings interacted directly with humans, and a later age when they became distant, unseen, transformed into memory and ritual rather than physical rulers. And supporters of the Anunnaki and Pleiadian narrative argue that this transition reflects the end of an era, that after conflict and devastation, the visitors withdrew, leaving behind only traces, temples that became sacred relics, knowledge that survived as fragmented tradition, and myths that encoded events too immense for ordinary history. And in this framework, humanity's development after the departure of these beings becomes both a liberation and a burden, because without divine overseers, humanity was finally free to shape its own destiny, yet also forced to confront a world where the architects of early civilization were no longer present. And thus societies continued to rise and fall. Empires replaced empires, but the memory of the sky gods endured, preserved through priesthoods, through sacred texts, through the persistent belief that civilization itself began with intervention from above. And this is why ancient kings so often claimed divine ancestry, why authority was tied to the heavens, because even after the gods were gone, the idea of their rule remained embedded in human structures, shaping power through the illusion of celestial legitimacy. And theorists suggest that this lingering influence is one of the greatest legacies of the Anunnaki narrative, not simply the idea of extraterrestrial creators, but the idea that control itself was sanctified, that obedience became holy, that hierarchy was justified by gods who once demanded labor, while at the same time the Pleiadian image survived as a counter-memory, a symbol of compassion, enlightenment, and the possibility that humanity was meant for more than servitude. And thus the struggle becomes internalized into human history itself, echoed through the endless conflict between domination and freedom, oppression and liberation, darkness and light. And whether or not these beings existed literally, the myths capture something deeply human. The sense that our origins contain forces beyond our understanding, that the ancient world was closer to the divine, that something was lost when the gods departed. And so the story continues, not with certainty, but with mystery, because the clay tablets remain incomplete, the ruins remain silent, and the stars remain distant, while humanity continues to look upward, searching for answers in the same heavens that ancient civilizations once believed were filled with visitors. And perhaps that is the true enduring power of these theories, that they transform our questions about creation into a cosmic drama, a war of celestial factions, an ancient struggle for Earth, leaving us to wonder whether the gods were ever real in the way we imagine, or whether they were always reflections of humanity's own search for meaning written across the sky. As time moved forward and humanity entered new ages of history, the so-called divine era became increasingly distant, Yet the stories never disappeared, because legends have a way of surviving where facts cannot, carried through generations not as precise records, but as symbols, echoes, and archetypes. And this is why the narrative of the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians, whether interpreted as mythology, metaphor, or speculative encounter, continues to resurface even in the modern world, because the questions it touches are among the deepest questions humanity can ask. Questions that science answers through evolution and cosmology, and religion answers through creation and spirit, yet neither completely silences the lingering sense of mystery. And so alternative theories emerge in the spaces between certainty, suggesting that perhaps humanity's origins were not entirely isolated, that perhaps ancient peoples were not simply imagining gods, but remembering something they could not explain. And this is why the Anunnaki story has gained such fascination in contemporary culture, because the rediscovery and translation of ancient Sumerian tablets revealed a world filled with celestial rulers, divine councils, and creation myths that sounded strangely vivid, and modern minds, shaped by the possibility of extraterrestrial life, began to reinterpret these accounts through a new lens, imagining that the gods were not supernatural, but advanced beings. And in this reinterpretation, the Anunnaki become architects of civilization, genetic engineers, rulers who demanded labor, while the Pleiadians become the luminous counterparts, spiritual guides opposing oppression, and the ancient war becomes a cosmic allegory projected onto the earliest civilizations. And what makes these ideas persist is not proof, but resonance, because they speak to humanity's sense that something extraordinary lies behind the sudden rise of civilization, behind the universal myths of sky beings, behind the shared human tendency to look upward and imagine origins beyond Earth. And in this way, the Anunnaki and Pleiadian narrative becomes less about literal history and more about the human imagination grappling with the unknown. Because whether these beings were real or symbolic, the myths reflect a profound truth. Humanity has always understood itself as connected to the heavens, as though the stars were not merely distant objects, but mirrors of destiny, and thus the Pleiades cluster remains a powerful symbol, appearing again and again across cultures as a marker of divine presence, while the Anunnaki remain a symbol of authority descending from above. And this is why in modern times, these stories merge with new ideas: ancient astronauts, lost civilizations, forbidden archaeology, creating a tapestry of speculation that continues to captivate those who feel that official history leaves unanswered gaps. And yet the mystery remains unresolved, because archaeology provides no undeniable evidence of extraterrestrial war, no confirmed trace of nuclear catastrophe in ancient Mesopotamia, and mainstream scholarship continues to interpret the Anunnaki as mythological deities rather than alien visitors. But still the stories persist, because myths do not require proof to endure. They require meaning, and the meaning here is powerful. The idea that humanity's beginnings may have been shaped by forces beyond itself, that civilization may have been influenced by something greater, that Earth may have once been part of a cosmic drama, and whether this is truth or imagination, it continues to shape belief, inspiring endless questions about who we are, where we came from, and whether we have ever truly been alone. Because perhaps the greatest legacy of these theories is not the claim of alien gods, but the reminder that humanity's search for origin is endless, and the sky remains as mysterious today as it was to the first people who looked up and saw the stars as the homes of gods. As the narrative approaches its final arc, what becomes most striking is how these ancient stories, whether interpreted as literal encounters or symbolic mythology, continue to occupy the space between history and imagination, because the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians ultimately represent more than extraterrestrial factions. They represent humanity's attempt to explain the unexplainable, to give shape to the mysteries of origin, civilization, and destiny. And in this sense, the ancient world was not simply recording events, but encoding meaning, transforming the unknown into gods, transforming the heavens into a stage where creation and destruction unfolded. And this is why the myths of Mesopotamia remain so powerful, because they speak of beings who shaped mankind, of divine councils deciding the fate of Earth, of conflict among celestial powers, and even if mainstream scholarship understands these accounts as religious cosmology rather than factual record, the persistence of the questions remains undeniable because humanity still wonders why civilization rose so quickly, why so many cultures share stories of sky visitors, why the stars have always felt like more than distant lights, and thus the Anunnaki narrative continues to resurface as a modern myth layered upon ancient myth, a speculative lens through which people reinterpret the past, not necessarily because evidence demands it, but because mystery invites it, because the absence of complete answers leaves room for alternative possibilities. And the Pleiadians, portrayed as beings of compassion and light, become symbols of humanity's hope that guidance from beyond would be benevolent rather than oppressive, while the Anunnaki, portrayed as rulers tied to authority and labor, become symbols of the fear that power from above could shape humanity for its own ends. And in this way, the so-called war between them becomes less a confirmed historical battle and more an eternal allegory, reflecting the struggle that has always existed within human civilization itself: domination versus freedom, control versus empathy, darkness versus light. And perhaps that is why these theories endure, because they externalize humanity's own conflicts onto the cosmos, turning ancient history into a celestial drama that feels both vast and intimate. And yet, at the center of it all, Earth remains the enigma, the only known world filled with life, the planet where consciousness emerged, where humans built temples, wrote myths, gazed at the stars, and asked the same questions across millennia. And whether the gods were truly visitors or merely reflections of human imagination, the truth is that the search itself defines us, because humanity has never stopped looking backward toward beginnings or upward toward the heavens. And so the Anunnaki and Pleiadian story remains, not as proven fact, but as one of many narratives that attempt to fill the voids of the unknown, reminding us that our origins are both scientifically traceable and spiritually mysterious, rooted in Earth yet always reaching beyond it. And perhaps the greatest lesson is not whether these beings came from the stars, but that humanity has always felt that its story is connected to something greater, that the heavens have always seemed close enough to inspire wonder, and that the myths of ancient cultures continue to whisper the same possibility, that the truth of our past may be deeper, stranger, and more mysterious than we have ever fully understood. As we reach the closing reflections of this narrative, what remains most powerful is not the certainty of an answer, but the persistence of the mystery, because stories like those of the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians endure precisely because they exist in the unresolved space between what humanity knows and what humanity wonders. And throughout history, civilizations have always tried to explain their beginnings through the language available to them, through gods, through heavens, through sacred visitors descending from the stars, because the origin of mankind has never been a simple question. It has always been the deepest question, one that touches identity, purpose, and the strange uniqueness of Earth itself. And so when ancient cultures spoke of divine creators, of rulers from above, of wars in the heavens, they were expressing something universal: the sense that humanity's story is not ordinary, that consciousness and civilization feel like phenomena too profound to be reduced entirely to survival. And whether these myths were symbolic or whether they preserve distorted memories of encounters beyond Earth, they continue to inspire because they mirror humanity's own eternal search. And in this way, the Anunnaki become an image of power, authority, and control, beings who shape and demand, while the Pleiadians become an image of empathy, wisdom, and liberation, beings who uplift and guide. And the alleged conflict between them becomes an archetype, a cosmic reflection of the struggles that have always existed within human societies. Because even without extraterrestrial visitors, humanity itself has always been caught between domination and freedom, exploitation and compassion, darkness and light. And thus these stories resonate not only as speculation about the past, but as metaphors for the present, reminding us that myths are not merely falsehoods, they are vessels of meaning, carrying the hopes and fears of civilizations across time. And perhaps that is why the stars remain so central, because the heavens have always represented the unknown, the vastness beyond Earth that invites both scientific exploration and spiritual imagination, and so the Pleiades cluster continues to shimmer in the night sky as it always has, a symbol onto which humans project origin, destiny, and the possibility of life beyond our world, while the ancient clay tablets of Sumer remain as silent witnesses of humanity's earliest attempts to write its place into the cosmos. And whether the Anunnaki were gods, metaphors, or visitors, the fact remains that their stories shaped one of the first civilizations, leaving behind myths that still echo thousands of years later. And in the end, perhaps the true enigma is not whether an ancient alien war occurred, but why humanity has always felt compelled to imagine such possibilities. Why we look at our own beginnings and sense that there is more, something hidden beneath the surface of history. Something that calls us to keep asking, keep searching, keep looking upward, because the story of mankind is not only written in bones and artifacts, but also in imagination, in myth, in the endless desire to understand who we are. And so the legend remains unfinished, suspended between skepticism and wonder, between science and story, leaving Earth as it has always been, a world of life, mystery, and unanswered questions beneath the silent stars. And so, as this documentary journey comes to its final close, we are left standing at the intersection of myth and mystery, where the ancient past fades into legend and the heavens remain as distant and silent as they were to the first humans who gazed upward in wonder, because the theories of the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians, whether viewed as speculative interpretations or symbolic echoes of ancient imagination, ultimately endure because they speak to something timeless within humanity. The longing to understand our beginnings, the desire to believe that our story is connected to something greater than the earth beneath our feet. And throughout history, civilizations have always looked to the skies for answers, transforming the unknown into gods, transforming the stars into origins, transforming cosmic silence into narratives of creation, guidance, and conflict. And in this way, the Anunnaki become a symbol of authority and control, of rulers descending from above to shape civilization, while the Pleiadians become a symbol of harmony and compassion, of beings who represent light, wisdom, and liberation. And the war between them becomes less a proven historical event and more an enduring archetype, a reflection of humanity's own struggles across time, because even without celestial visitors, humanity has always lived between forces of domination and freedom, exploitation and empathy, darkness and hope. And perhaps that is why these ancient stories continue to resonate, because they externalize the deepest questions of human existence onto the cosmos, turning our origins into a drama vast enough to match the scale of our wonder. And yet, when all is said and done, Earth remains the enigma, the only known world filled with life, the planet where consciousness awakened, where civilizations rose from dust, where myths were carved into clay, and where the stars became both a map and a mirror for human imagination. And whether the gods of the ancient world were literal beings or symbolic creations, the truth is that the mystery of origin remains one of the greatest forces driving humanity forward, because science continues to explore the mechanisms of life and evolution. Archaeology continues to uncover the fragments of forgotten civilizations, and the human spirit continues to ask questions that reach beyond evidence into meaning. And so the legend of celestial visitors persists, not because it is confirmed, but because it reminds us of how vast the unknown still is, how much of our past remains incomplete, and how deeply humans are drawn to the possibility that we are part of a story larger than ourselves. And perhaps that is the final haunting note, that whether the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians were gods, metaphors, or imagined echoes of the stars, the very act of telling such stories reveals something essential about mankind, that we are a species forever looking backward toward origins and upward toward the cosmos, forever searching for the missing pieces of our beginning, and forever standing beneath the silent heavens, wondering what truths may still lie hidden among the stars. A journey through time and possibility. Throughout this extensive exploration of humanity's oldest questions and the theories surrounding the Anunnaki and Pleiadians, we have traversed a landscape where history, mythology, and speculation converge in fascinating and provocative ways. The journey has taken us from the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, where the first known civilization emerged with startling sophistication, to the distant star cluster of the Pleiades, which has captivated human imagination across continents and millennia. We have examined the possibility that Earth was not merely a cradle for life's spontaneous emergence, but perhaps a stage upon which forces from beyond our world once played out dramas of creation, conflict, and control that would shape the destiny of humanity itself. As we reach the conclusion of this documentary exploration, it becomes essential to step back from the specific claims and counterclaims, the ancient texts and modern interpretations, and consider what these enduring stories truly represent within the broader context of human consciousness, cultural development, and our species' eternal search for meaning. For whether one approaches the Anunnaki as literal extraterrestrial beings who genetically engineered humanity, or as mythological deities through which ancient peoples expressed their understanding of cosmic order, the power of these narratives cannot be dismissed as mere fantasy. They persist because they speak to something fundamental about the human condition, our profound need to understand where we came from, why we exist, and whether we are alone in the vast expanse of existence. The Sumerian Foundation, History's First Chapter. The Sumerian civilization, which flourished in Mesopotamia between approximately 4500 and 1900 BCE, represents humanity's first great experiment with organized society. Before the rise of Egypt, before the glory of Greece and Rome, before the philosophical traditions of China and India reached their classical forms, the Sumerians were building cities, developing writing systems, creating legal codes, and contemplating the heavens with an astronomical precision that continues to astonish modern researchers. Their legacy, preserved on thousands of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform script, provides our earliest written records of human thought, including extensive mythological narratives about beings called the Anunnaki. The academic interpretation of these texts understands the Anunnaki as a pantheon of deities within Mesopotamian religion, gods and goddesses who represented natural forces, celestial bodies, and the organizing principles of society. They were figures of immense power who could grant fertility or bring famine, who could bless cities with prosperity or destroy them with flood and fire. This interpretation places the Anunnaki within the broader context of human religious development, where cultures across the world have consistently created divine hierarchies to explain phenomena beyond their control and to establish moral and social order. Yet the alternative interpretation, which has gained considerable traction in popular culture and among proponents of ancient astronaut theories, sees something else entirely in these same texts. For them, the Anunnaki were not supernatural beings, but physical entities. Extraterrestrial visitors from a planet called Nibiru who arrived on Earth in the distant past, bringing with them technology so advanced that primitive humans could only interpret it as divine power. This reading transforms Sumerian mythology from religious cosmology into distorted history, from symbolic narrative into eyewitness account, filtered through the limited understanding of ancient observers. The appeal of this interpretation lies partly in its ability to explain certain features of Sumerian civilization that have long intrigued scholars: the sudden emergence of complex writing systems, sophisticated astronomical knowledge, and monumental architecture that appeared with remarkable rapidity in historical terms. If the Anunnaki were real beings who taught and guided early humans, then these developments become comprehensible as the result of external intervention rather than gradual cultural evolution. The question becomes not whether Sumerian civilization was remarkable, it unquestionably was, but whether its achievements can be adequately explained through the normal processes of human innovation and cultural transmission. The Pleiadian counterpoint, light amidst dominion. Alongside the Anunnaki narrative, the Pleiadians represent a complementary but philosophically distinct thread within this speculative tapestry. described in various esoteric and channeled traditions as beings of higher spiritual development who originate from the star cluster visible in the night sky as a small grouping of bright stars. The Pleiadians are typically portrayed as benevolent guides rather than dominating rulers, where the Anunnaki narrative emphasizes control, labor, and hierarchical authority. The Pleiadian narrative emphasizes freedom, spiritual evolution, and compassionate assistance. This dichotomy creates a powerful symbolic framework that resonates with deep patterns in human consciousness. Throughout history, humanity has conceived of divine or superhuman forces as embodying both creative and destructive potentials, both loving and wrathful aspects. The distinction between Anunnaki and Pleiadians can be understood as a particular expression of this universal dualism: the forces that bind and the forces that liberate, the powers that demand obedience and the powers that offer enlightenment. The Pleiadian tradition, though less grounded in ancient textual sources than the Anunnaki narrative, draws upon the remarkable fact that the Pleiades star cluster holds special significance in cultures across the world, from the indigenous peoples of North America to the Aboriginal traditions of Australia. From ancient Greece to pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, the Pleiades have been recognized as a distinctive celestial marker, often associated with important agricultural cycles, ceremonial calendars, and mythological narratives about origins and destiny. This cross-cultural consistency suggests something profound about human relationship with the heavens, a universal recognition that certain patterns in the sky carry meaning that transcends local cultural boundaries. Whether this universal recognition of the Pleiades reflects ancient contact with beings from that region, as proponents suggest, or simply represents the striking visual prominence of the cluster and its seasonal visibility patterns, as astronomers would argue, the fact remains that the Pleiades have functioned as a kind of celestial anchor for human imagination across millennia. They represent the possibility that the stars are not merely distant balls of burning gas, but meaningful presences in the human story. The question of conflict, Earth as cosmic battleground. Perhaps the most dramatic element within these speculative narratives is the suggestion that Earth became the site of conflict between these two extraterrestrial civilizations, a war fought not for territory in the conventional sense, but for control over humanity and the future direction of planetary development. This conflict, according to proponents, stemmed from fundamentally different philosophical orientations toward the human species. The Anunnaki, needing labor for mining operations and resource extraction, allegedly viewed humans as a created workforce, beings designed for servitude, engineered for obedience, and valued primarily for their utility. The Pleiadians, by contrast, allegedly viewed humans as a species with inherent dignity and potential for spiritual evolution, beings deserving of freedom, guidance toward enlightenment, and protection from exploitation. This cosmic struggle, projected onto the screen of ancient history, becomes a powerful metaphor for tensions that have always existed within human civilization itself. The conflict between those who would dominate and those who would liberate, between systems of control and movements toward freedom, between viewing others as resources and recognizing them as ends in themselves. These are not alien concerns, but deeply human ones. The narrative of Anunnaki-Pleiadian warfare externalizes these internal struggles, projecting them onto a cosmic canvas where they achieve mythic proportions. The suggestion that this conflict culminated in actual warfare involving advanced weaponry, perhaps even nuclear-scale destruction that left radioactive traces in the ancient world, adds a catastrophic dimension to the narrative that resonates with modern anxieties about technology and survival. The mysterious collapse of Sumerian civilization around 2024 BCE, which mainstream scholarship attributes to a combination of environmental, political, and military factors, becomes in this interpretation a casualty of extraterrestrial warfare, a civilization destroyed as collateral damage in a conflict between powers far beyond human comprehension or control. The image of a radioactive cloud drifting from the Sinai Peninsula to engulf Mesopotamia, rendering cities uninhabitable and lands infertile, is haunting precisely because it echoes contemporary fears about nuclear annihilation. Whether or not such an event actually occurred in the ancient world, the narrative speaks to deep concerns about technology exceeding human wisdom, about powers beyond our control determining our fate, about the fragility of civilization in the face of forces we cannot fully understand. Ancient texts and modern interpretations. The relationship between ancient texts and modern interpretations lies at the heart of this entire speculative edifice. The Sumerian tablets, the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Hindu Vedas, the Mayan codices. These are genuine artifacts of human history, preserved through millennia, carrying the thoughts and beliefs of our ancestors. What they mean, however, is not self-evident. Interpretation requires context, linguistic expertise, cultural understanding, and theoretical frameworks that shape how we understand what we read. Mainstream scholarship approaches these texts with methodologies developed over centuries of academic study: comparative linguistics, archaeological context, anthropological understanding of religious development, and careful attention to the symbolic structures of mythological thinking all contribute to interpretations that see the Anunnaki as deities within a complex religious system, not as historical extraterrestrial visitors. From this perspective, the stories of gods descending from heavens, creating humans, and engaging in conflicts reflect ancient peoples' attempts to understand their world and their place within cosmic order, not eyewitness accounts of actual events. Alternative interpretations, however, challenge the assumptions underlying mainstream scholarship. They argue that the consistency of certain themes across cultures, separated by vast distances and lacking known contact, suggests common sources rather than independent invention. They point to specific details within ancient texts, descriptions of gods with technological capabilities, references to celestial origins, accounts of genetic manipulation that seem too precise to be merely symbolic. They question whether modern scholars, working within naturalistic frameworks that exclude the possibility of extraterrestrial intervention, might be systematically underestimating the literal content of ancient accounts. This interpretive divide cannot be resolved simply by appealing to evidence, because the same evidence supports different conclusions depending on the interpretive framework applied. The Sumerian tablets exist. What they mean depends on what we bring to them. For those who accept the possibility of ancient extraterrestrial contact, the tablets become evidence supporting that possibility. For those who work within conventional historical and archaeological frameworks, the tablets remain examples of religious mythology. The evidence itself does not decide between these interpretations. It is interpreted in light of prior assumptions about what is possible and what constitutes reliable knowledge. The enduring power of mystery. Why do these theories persist, despite lacking confirmation from mainstream scholarship? Why do the Anunnaki and Pleiadians continue to captivate imagination, generating books, documentaries, online communities, and passionate debate? The answer lies not in evidence, but in the human relationship with mystery itself. Human consciousness seems to require certain kinds of questions to remain open. The origin of our species, the nature of consciousness, the possibility of life beyond Earth, the meaning of existence. These are not questions that can be finally settled by empirical investigation alone, because they touch upon dimensions of experience that transcend the measurable. Science can trace the evolutionary development of Homo sapiens, can map the genetic relationships between populations, can identify the environmental factors that shaped human prehistory. But science cannot answer why consciousness emerged, whether that emergence was inevitable or accidental, or what meaning we should attach to our existence. Religious traditions offer answers to these questions, but those answers vary across cultures and cannot be empirically verified. They require faith, commitment to particular interpretive communities, and acceptance of authoritative teachings. For many people in the modern world, traditional religious answers have become unsatisfying, yet the questions remain urgent. In this space between scientific limitation and religious uncertainty, alternative narratives flourish. The Anunnaki Pleiadian narrative offers something that neither mainstream science nor traditional religion quite provides: a story that is both empirically grounded in ancient texts and archaeological remains, and spiritually meaningful, addressing questions of purpose, freedom, and cosmic connection. It presents itself not as faith requiring belief without evidence, nor as science limited to measurable phenomena, but as a kind of hidden history, a truth suppressed by orthodox scholarship, awaiting rediscovery by those willing to question official narratives. This structure, the revelation of suppressed truth, the challenge to established authority, the promise that reality is more interesting than we have been taught, has powerful appeal in contemporary culture. It positions believers as enlightened truth seekers, as courageous questioners of dogmatic systems, as participants in the recovery of lost knowledge. Whether or not the specific claims about Anunnaki and Pleiadians are accurate, the narrative form itself satisfies deep psychological needs for meaning, significance, and belonging to a community of those who know. Earth's uniqueness, the undeniable context. Amidst all the speculation about extraterrestrial visitors and ancient conflicts, one fact remains beyond dispute. Earth is unique in our current knowledge. It is the only planet known to harbor life, the only world where consciousness has emerged, the only place where civilization has developed. This uniqueness is not a matter of belief, but of observation. We have explored our solar system, studied exoplanets, searched for signs of life elsewhere, and found nothing comparable to the biological and cultural richness of Earth. This uniqueness demands explanation. For religious traditions, it reflects divine purpose. Earth was created as the stage for human drama, the arena within which souls work out their salvation. For scientific naturalism, it reflects the extraordinary confluence of conditions necessary for life: the right distance from the right star, the right planetary composition, the right geological history, the right sequence of evolutionary accidents. Both explanations are possible. Neither can be definitively proven. The Anunnaki Pleiadian narrative offers a third possibility: that Earth's uniqueness attracted attention from elsewhere, that life here became interesting to beings from beyond, that humanity's development was not left entirely to chance, but was shaped by intervention. This possibility cannot be dismissed a priori because we have no way of knowing what exists beyond our observational reach. The universe is vast, time is deep, and our knowledge is limited. To assert with certainty that Earth has never been visited by extraterrestrial intelligences would be as unjustified as asserting with certainty that it has been. The question is not whether such visitation is possible, we cannot know, but what constitutes reasonable belief given available evidence. Mainstream scholarship concludes that ancient texts and archaeological remains are adequately explained without invoking extraterrestrial intervention, and that such invocation introduces unnecessary and untestable assumptions. Alternative theorists conclude that the same evidence points toward intervention, and that mainstream scholarship is blind to possibilities outside its naturalistic framework. Both positions rest on judgments about what constitutes adequate explanation and what counts as reasonable inference. The limits of knowledge. Perhaps the most honest conclusion to this exploration is an acknowledgement of limits, the limits of our knowledge about the ancient past, the limits of our ability to interpret texts from cultures radically different from our own, the limits of our frameworks for understanding what is possible in the universe. These limits do not mean that knowledge is impossible, but they do mean that certainty about many questions is unattainable. We know that Sumerian civilization existed and produced remarkable cultural achievements. We know that the Anunnaki appear in their texts as significant figures. We know that many ancient cultures attribute their origins to divine or celestial beings. We know that the Pleiades cluster holds cross-cultural significance. These are facts established through empirical investigation and scholarly consensus. What we do not know is what these facts ultimately mean. We do not know whether the Anunnaki were mythological personifications or memories of actual beings. We do not know whether ancient accounts of celestial visitors reflect encounters with extraterrestrials or symbolic expressions of religious experience. We do not know whether the cross-cultural significance of the Pleiades results from ancient contact, astronomical observation, or psychological universals. We do not know whether humanity's origins involved intervention from beyond Earth or emerged entirely through natural processes. This uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship, but a condition of historical investigation. The past is inaccessible to direct observation. We reconstruct it from traces that remain, interpreting those traces through frameworks that shape what we can see. Different frameworks yield different reconstructions, and we have no neutral standpoint from which to judge between them definitively. The best we can do is evaluate interpretations by their coherence, their explanatory power, their consistency with available evidence, and their capacity to illuminate rather than obscure. The symbolic dimension. Beyond questions of literal truth, the Anunnaki and Pleiadian narratives have symbolic dimensions that deserve serious consideration. Whatever their historical accuracy, these stories express truths about human experience that transcend factual verification. The Anunnaki represent the experience of power that transcends human control, the forces that shape our lives from beyond, the systems that demand our labor and obedience, the authorities that claim divine sanction for their rule. In this sense, the Anunnaki narrative is not about ancient aliens, but about the enduring human experience of subjection to powers we did not create and cannot fully control. Whether those powers are understood as gods, as economic systems, as political structures, or as natural forces, the experience of being subject to them is universal. The Pleiadians represent the countervailing experience of liberation, the possibility of transcendence, the hope for guidance toward enlightenment, the belief that forces of compassion exist alongside forces of control. In this sense, the Pleiadian narrative expresses humanity's perennial hope that freedom is possible, that oppression is not the final word, that beings or principles of higher wisdom can assist us in our evolution toward greater consciousness. The conflict between them represents the tension that exists within every human society and every human soul between domination and liberation, control and freedom, exploitation and compassion. This tension is not a matter of ancient history, but of present experience. It plays out in our politics, our relationships, our struggles with our own natures. To project it onto the cosmos is to recognize its cosmic significance, to affirm that the choices between these alternatives matter not only for individuals and societies, but for the meaning of existence itself. The question of evidence. For those who seek literal truth about ancient extraterrestrial contact, the question of evidence remains central. What would constitute proof that the Anunnaki were real beings who visited Earth? What would convince mainstream scholarship to reconsider its naturalistic assumptions? The answer is not simple, because evidence is always interpreted within frameworks. Artifacts that might seem anomalous, unexplained technological achievements, depictions of beings that resemble modern descriptions of extraterrestrials, texts that describe celestial origins, can always be explained within conventional frameworks as products of human ingenuity operating within normal historical processes. The discovery of a clearly extraterrestrial artifact, a device using materials or technologies unknown on Earth, a structure that could not have been built by ancient humans, a genetic trace of non-terrestrial origin, would be required to shift the consensus. No such evidence has been found, despite decades of searching by proponents of ancient astronaut theories. This absence does not prove that such evidence will never be found, but it does explain why mainstream scholarship remains unconvinced. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence currently available is susceptible to ordinary explanations. Yet, absence of proof is not proof of absence. The archaeological record is fragmentary. Most of what existed in the ancient world has perished. Texts have been lost, structures have crumbled, artifacts have been destroyed or remain undiscovered. The possibility that evidence of extraterrestrial contact existed and has not survived cannot be ruled out. The possibility that such evidence awaits discovery in unexcavated sites or unrecognized contexts remains open. This openness to possibility, however, must be balanced against the requirements of responsible belief. To believe something on insufficient evidence is to risk error. To refuse belief despite suggestive evidence is to risk missing truth. The prudent course lies somewhere between credulity and skepticism, remaining open to possibilities while demanding rigorous evidence before accepting extraordinary claims. Humanity's search for meaning. Perhaps the deepest significance of the Anunnaki and Pleiadian narratives lies not in their factual accuracy, but in what they reveal about humanity's eternal search for meaning. We are a species that cannot simply exist. We must understand our existence, must place it within stories that give it significance, must connect our individual lives to larger narratives that transcend our brief mortal span. This need for meaning is not a weakness to be overcome, but a fundamental aspect of human consciousness. We are meaning-making creatures, and the stories we tell about our origins are among the most important meanings we make. They tell us who we are, where we belong, what we can hope for, how we should live. They connect us to ancestors and descendants, to the natural world and the cosmos, to forces beyond our control and possibilities within our reach. The Anunnaki narrative offers meaning through connection to powerful beings who shaped our destiny. It tells us that we are not accidental products of blind evolutionary processes, but intentional creations designed for purposes that transcend mere survival. It offers the comfort of significance, the assurance that humanity matters in cosmic terms, that our existence is noticed and valued by powers greater than ourselves. The Pleiadian narrative offers meaning through possibility of evolution and liberation. It tells us that we are not trapped in our current condition, but capable of growth toward higher consciousness, guided by compassionate beings who wish us well. It offers the hope of transcendence, the promise that our limitations are not final, that we can become more than we currently are. Both narratives, whatever their literal truth, address deep human needs. The need to matter, the need to hope, the need to believe that our existence has meaning beyond the material terms in which science describes it. These needs are not invalid simply because they cannot be satisfied by empirical evidence. They are part of what it means to be human, and the stories we tell to satisfy them deserve respect, even when they cannot be verified. The cosmic perspective. One of the most valuable contributions of these narratives, regardless of their factual status, is the cosmic perspective they encourage. They invite us to look beyond Earth, beyond our immediate concerns, beyond the narrow frameworks of ordinary experience, and contemplate our place in the vastness of existence. This perspective has value independent of any particular claims about ancient visitors. When we consider the possibility that Earth has been visited by beings from other worlds, we are forced to confront our assumptions about what is possible in the universe. We are reminded that our knowledge is limited, that reality may be stranger than our current frameworks allow, that humanity may not be as isolated as we sometimes imagine. This humility before the unknown is intellectually and spiritually healthy. When we consider the possibility that ancient peoples recorded encounters they could not fully understand, we are reminded of the limitations of all historical knowledge. We see that our ancestors were not simply primitive versions of ourselves, but possessed their own frameworks for understanding reality. Frameworks that may have captured aspects of experience that our frameworks miss. This recognition of alternative ways of knowing enriches our understanding of human diversity and potential. When we consider the possibility that Earth's uniqueness has attracted attention from elsewhere, we are invited to reflect on what makes this world special, not just in astronomical terms, but in terms of the life and consciousness it has generated. We are reminded of our responsibility to preserve and protect this precious planet, the only home we know, the only world confirmed to harbor the miracle of existence. The unanswered question. Despite centuries of scholarship and decades of alternative investigation, the fundamental questions remain unanswered. Where did humanity come from? Why do we exist? Are we alone? These questions persist because they touch upon mysteries that may be permanently beyond our capacity to resolve. The origin of consciousness, the nature of life, the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence. These are not puzzles that yield to empirical investigation alone, but mysteries that engage our whole being. The Anunnaki and Pleiadian narratives offer answers to these questions, but those answers cannot be verified. They remain possibilities, not certainties, speculations, not knowledge. This does not make them worthless. Imagination and speculation have their place in human life, but it does mean they cannot substitute for the rigorous investigation that characterizes genuine inquiry. Perhaps the wisest response to these enduring questions is to hold them open, to resist premature closure, to maintain both skepticism and wonder, to continue searching while acknowledging that complete answers may never come. This openness is not intellectual weakness, but intellectual honesty, recognition that reality exceeds our capacity to comprehend it fully. The legacy of ancient imagination. Whatever the factual status of the Anunnaki and Pleiadians, the ancient peoples who first conceived of such beings left us a precious legacy, evidence that humans have always looked beyond themselves for understanding, have always imagined connections between earth and sky, have always sought to place their lives within larger contexts of meaning. This legacy is not diminished by subsequent reinterpretation, but enriched by it. The Sumerians who carved stories of Anunnaki onto clay tablets could not have imagined that their myths would still be debated thousands of years later, would generate documentaries and books and online communities, would become vehicles for exploring questions they could barely formulate. Yet this is what has happened, ancient imagination speaking to modern concerns, bridging millennia through the power of story. The cultures that saw significance in the Pleiades, that built calendars and ceremonies around their appearance, that told stories of beings arriving from that cluster, left us evidence of a relationship with the cosmos that modern civilization has largely lost. We know more about the Pleiades as astronomical objects than any ancient people could, their distance, composition, motion through space, but we have largely lost the sense of connection, the feeling that these stars matter to us personally and communally. Perhaps the Anunnaki and Pleiadian narratives, whatever their literal truth, can help us recover something of this connection. They invite us to look up with wonder, to contemplate our place in the cosmos, to imagine possibilities beyond our current understanding. They remind us that the stars are not merely objects of scientific study, but sources of wonder, inspiration, and meaning. Final reflections. As this exploration draws to a close, we return to where we began, with the fundamental questions that have driven human inquiry since consciousness emerged. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? These questions have no final answers, only temporary resting places, moments of satisfaction that give way to renewed inquiry. The Anunnaki and Pleiadian narratives offer one set of resting places, provisional answers that satisfy some seekers while leaving others unsatisfied. For those who find meaning in these stories, they provide frameworks for understanding human origins and destiny that resonate with deep needs for significance and connection. For those who remain skeptical, they illustrate the human capacity for imaginative construction, the way we create stories to fill the voids in our knowledge. Between these responses lies the territory of genuine inquiry, the willingness to hold questions open, to consider possibilities without premature commitment, to maintain both the rigor that demands evidence and the openness that allows wonder. This territory is uncomfortable. It offers no certainties, no final conclusions, no definitive answers, but it is the territory where genuine understanding grows, where knowledge advances while remaining humble before the unknown. Earth remains, as it has always been, a world of mystery. The life that covers its surface, the consciousness that has emerged within that life, the civilizations that have risen and fallen across its history, these constitute a phenomenon as remarkable as any in the known universe. Whether this phenomenon developed entirely through natural processes or was shaped by intervention from beyond, whether humans are alone in consciousness or part of a larger community of intelligence, whether our future will unfold in isolation or in connection with others, these questions await answers that may never come. In the meantime, we have the stories. We have the Sumerian tablets and the Mayan codices, the Hindu Vedas and the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the myths and legends of countless cultures that looked to the sky and imagined beings who came from beyond. We have the Anunnaki and the Pleiadians, the gods and goddesses, the visitors and guides, the rulers and liberators. We have the enduring human capacity to wonder, to imagine, to seek meaning in the face of mystery. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the questions matter more than the answers, the seeking more than the finding, the wonder more than the certainty. Perhaps what defines humanity is not our knowledge, but our longing, our endless reaching beyond what we know toward what we hope might be true. The Anunnaki and Pleiadians, whatever they were or were not, have become part of this longing. They represent our hope that we are not alone, that our origins are significant, that our existence matters in cosmic terms. They represent our fear that we may be controlled by forces beyond our understanding, that our freedom may be limited by powers we cannot see. They represent our wonder at the vastness of existence and our place within it. In the end, the truth about these beings may never be known. The evidence may remain ambiguous, the interpretations may remain contested, the questions may remain open, but the human capacity for wonder, for imagination, for meaning-making, this will endure. And as long as it endures, the stories will continue to be told, the questions will continue to be asked, and the mystery of our origins will continue to inspire. The Anunnaki came from heaven to earth, the ancient texts say. The Pleiadians arrived from the cluster of stars, the traditions declare. Whether these statements describe literal events or symbolic truths, they express something essential about human experience. The sense that we are connected to something beyond ourselves, that the sky is not merely above us, but within us, that the stars are not distant and indifferent, but somehow part of our story. And so we return to the beginning, to the questions that have no final answers, to the mystery that will not resolve. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? These questions remain as they have always remained, inviting us to wonder, to seek, to imagine. The Anunnaki and Pleiadians are part of that invitation, not answers, but possibilities, not conclusions, but openings, not certainties, but wonders. Earth remains the only world known to harbor life, the only planet where consciousness has emerged, the only place where civilizations have risen and fallen across millennia. Whether this uniqueness is accidental or intended, whether it reflects isolation or connection, whether it represents beginning or middle or end, these questions await answers that may never come. In the meantime, we have each other, we have our stories, we have our wonder. We have the night sky, filled with stars that have guided human imagination since consciousness emerged. We have the ancient texts, preserving thoughts from minds that wondered as we wonder, sought as we seek, imagined as we imagine. We have the ongoing conversation between past and present, between evidence and imagination, between what we know and what we hope. The Anunnaki and Pleiadians are part of that conversation. They represent possibilities that cannot be dismissed and cannot be confirmed. They embody questions that will not disappear and answers that will not settle. They are, in the deepest sense, expressions of the human spirit reaching beyond itself toward the infinite. And so, this exploration ends where it began, with mystery, with wonder, with questions that have no final answers. The origin of mankind remains, as it has always remained, one of the greatest enigmas of existence. The theories will continue to proliferate, the evidence will continue to be debated, the interpretations will continue to evolve. But the questions themselves, where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? These will endure as long as humanity endures. Perhaps that is the deepest truth of all, that we are creatures who ask questions, who seek meaning, who wonder at the mystery of our own existence. The Anunnaki and Pleiadians, whether literal beings or symbolic creations, have become part of that seeking. They remind us that the universe is vast, that knowledge is limited, that imagination is precious. They invite us to look up, to wonder, to question, and in doing so, they help us remain fully human. For in the end, it is not the answers that define us, but the asking. Not the certainties, but the wonder. Not the knowledge, but the longing to know. The Anunnaki came from heaven to earth, the ancient texts say. Perhaps the truth is that we have always been reaching from earth toward heaven, seeking connection with something beyond ourselves, hoping that the stars are not silent and the universe is not empty. That reaching, that seeking, that hoping, this is what makes us human. And as long as we reach, as long as we seek, as long as we hope, the questions will remain alive, and the mystery will remain open, and the story will continue. Epilogue. Beyond conclusion. Every conclusion is also a beginning. Every ending opens onto new questions. Every answer generates further inquiry. The exploration of humanity's origins, the consideration of possible extraterrestrial contact, the contemplation of ancient myths and modern interpretations. These are not tasks that can be completed, but processes that continue as long as humans exist. The Anunnaki and Pleiadian narratives will likely persist, evolving with each generation, adapting to new knowledge and new concerns. They will be reinterpreted through new frameworks, connected to new discoveries, employed in new arguments about who we are and where we come from. This persistence is not evidence of their truth, but evidence of their power, their capacity to speak to enduring human needs and concerns. What future research might reveal about ancient civilizations, about the possibility of extraterrestrial life, about the nature of consciousness and origins, this cannot be predicted. Discoveries await that would transform our understanding, that would make current debates seem primitive, that would open possibilities we cannot currently imagine. The only certainty is uncertainty, the only constant is change, the only reliable conclusion is that conclusions are never final. And so we leave this exploration not with closure, but with openness, not with answers, but with questions, not with certainty, but with wonder. The Anunnaki and Pleiadians remain, as they have always remained, invitations to imagination, challenges to complacency, reminders that reality may be stranger than we suppose. The stars continue to shine above Earth, as they have shone since consciousness first looked up and wondered. The ancient texts continue to wait in museums and archives, preserving thoughts from minds long silent. The questions continue to echo through generations, connecting us to ancestors and descendants, to all who have wondered and all who will wonder after us. In this continuity, this endless conversation across time, this shared engagement with mystery, here is meaning enough, here is purpose enough, here is humanity, reaching always beyond itself toward the infinite, seeking always to understand what it means to exist, to be conscious, to wonder at the stars. The Anunnaki came from heaven to earth, the ancient texts say. Perhaps they still come, in every moment of wonder, in every question asked, in every reaching toward the unknown. Perhaps the visitors are not beings from elsewhere, but dimensions of our own consciousness, aspects of ourselves that we have yet to fully recognize. Perhaps the war between domination and liberation, control and freedom, darkness and light. This war is not ancient history but present reality, fought not in the heavens but in every human heart. Whatever the truth, the questions remain. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? These questions will not be finally answered, not in this generation or any generation. They will remain, as they have always remained, invitations to wonder, calls to inquiry, openings onto mystery. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.